There are moments in a city's history when the law walks into a room believing it is about to make an example of someone, only to discover it is the example. New York City had one of those moments in the summer of 1963. At the time, the newspapers framed it as routine. Another gangster, another narcotics case, another black crime boss finally meeting the long arm of justice. That's how it was sold to the public. But what happened inside that courtroom had nothing to do with drugs and everything to do with power. Because this was not a trial meant to decide guilt. It was a trial meant to remind a man of his place. By 1963, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had already outlived every prediction made about him. He was supposed to die young, loud, and violently, cut down by rivals or erased by prison walls. Instead, he had become something far more dangerous. He became permanent. Harlem didn't just know his name, it moved to his rhythm. Rent disputes, street beefs, numbers, money, protection. None of it happened without his shadow touching it first. He wasn't elected, he wasn't appointed, he simply was. And that terrified the people who believed cities were supposed to be controlled quietly, behind closed doors, by men who never showed their hands, especially judges. Judge Harrison Thorne had built his reputation on being immovable. In public, he was law and order. In private, he was something else entirely. But that part had always stayed buried, protected by status and silence. Thorne did not see himself as corrupt. Men like him never do. He believed the system worked because men like him ran it. And when someone like Bumpy Johnson slipped through its gears, when a black man accumulated money, influence, and fear without permission, that wasn't entrepreneurship. That was rebellion. So Thorne decided to end it. The case itself was an insult to intelligence, a conspiracy charge stitched together from whispers, addicts, and favors owed. No paper trail. No physical evidence, no urgency, because urgency wasn't required. The outcome was already decided. By the time the trial began, the jury had been chosen with surgical precision. The objections would be ignored, the witnesses would be guided, and the verdict would arrive exactly when expected. Justice wasn't blind in that courtroom. It was obedient. What the public didn't know, what the press didn't know, was that Bumpy Johnson understood something most men never do. He understood that power doesn't live in the courtroom. It visits. And on that day, power had already chosen its exit. Inside the courtroom, the heat was unbearable. Not because the air conditioning failed, but because too many people knew they were watching something irreversible. On one side sat the city's respectable face, prosecutors, donors, political friends of the court, men who congratulated themselves on surviving the city by controlling it. Behind them stood Harlem. No signs, no chants, just presence. They weren't there to cheer. They were there to witness. Harlem had buried enough men to recognize when one was being prepared for sacrifice. At the defense table, Bumpy Johnson sat still. He did not perform outrage. He did not plead innocence. He did not play the role assigned to him. That alone unsettled people. Men who are about to lose everything usually radiate panic. They sweat. They twitch. They search for eye contact, mercy, anything. Bumpy did none of that. He watched the judge. Judge Thorne, for his part, enjoyed the moment. He believed he was watching history bend back into place. Another correction. Another disorder removed. Yet he did not realize, what no one in that room realized yet, was that the trial had already ended. The sentence had already been written. It just wasn't Bumpy Johnson's. When Judge Thorne finally spoke, when he called Bumpy to stand, the courtroom leaned forward, ready to hear the sound of a man being broken. What they were about to hear instead would fracture the room, the system, and several lives that had believed themselves untouchable. Because this wasn't the day Harlem lost its king. This was the day the court discovered it had been standing on the wrong square of the board. and it was already in check. The verdict came back fast, too fast. 12 white men disappeared into a room and returned before their coffee could cool. No questions, no hesitation, no request to review testimony. They didn't even bother with lunch. That told you everything you needed to know. In New York City, when a jury moves that quickly, it isn't deciding anything. It's confirming instructions. Guilty. One word, heavy, final, familiar. A sound Harlem had heard before. Judge Harrison Thorne didn't hide his satisfaction. He didn't have to. The law was on his side. At least that's what he believed. Years of conditioning had taught him that when the system moved in unison, resistance was already dead. The courtroom went quiet in that peculiar way it does when everyone understands the next part is ceremonial. This wasn't about judgment anymore. This was about humiliation. Thorne shuffled his papers slowly, deliberately. He wanted the silence to stretch. He wanted Bumpy Johnson standing there long enough for doubt to creep in, long enough for the room to absorb who held the power. The fans clicked and thumped uselessly in the corners. Sweat traced lines down temples. Someone coughed and immediately stopped as if sound itself had become disrespectful. Thorne took a sip of water from a crystal glass. Crystal. Even that mattered. Then he spoke. "Ellsworth Johnson, please rise." Bumpy stood. No rush, no resistance, no drama. He adjusted his jacket like a man preparing for a meeting, not an ending. That unsettled the judge. Most men, at this moment, shrink. They look smaller than they did when they sat down. Their shoulders slope inward, as if the verdict has weight. Bumpy looked taller. Judge Thorne leaned forward, studying him, the way a man studies prey he believes is already wounded. "Before sentencing," Thorne said, "the court will ask the defendant if he wishes to speak." This was not mercy. This was bait. Thorne wanted begging. He wanted apology. He wanted submission. He wanted Bumpy Johnson to perform regret for the record so the newspapers could print it neatly between ads for cigarettes and summer suits. But Bumpy did not play roles written by other men. "I have nothing to say that this court would understand," he said. No tremor, no anger, just fact. The judge smiled. That smile wasn't confidence, it was cruelty. It was the smile of a man who believes he has reached the moment where consequences only flow outward. "You think yourself above this court," Thorne said, "above the law, above decent society." This was where Thorne stopped pretending. The mask slipped because it didn't need to stay on anymore. He spoke not as judge, but as a gatekeeper whose authority had been challenged for too long. "You parade around this city in fine clothes," he continued. "You flash money you did not earn. You poison your own neighborhood and call yourself important." The room stiffened. Even the prosecutors avoided eye contact now, not out of sympathy, but because naked truth, even ugly truth, makes cowards uncomfortable. Thorne leaned back, warming to his own voice. "I don't see a businessman when I look at you. I see an animal who has mistaken a suit for civilization." There it was. Not law, not justice, not even pretense, just belief. Belief that some men are meant to rule and others are meant to be managed or removed. Harlem heard it clearly. This was never about narcotics. This was about reminding a black man that no matter how carefully he played the game, the board did not belong to him. Thorne lifted the gavel. The sound echoed louder than it should have. "I sentence you to the maximum." "Penalty allowed by law," he said. 40 years. 40 years is not a number. It is a decision. It means you will die inside walls built by people who do not care how long it takes. It means your world will shrink to concrete, steel, and memory. Thorne was smiling again now. This was his victory. Or so he thought. Because when the noise exploded, when Harlem cried out, when reporters shouted, when the courtroom fractured into sound, Thorne noticed something wrong. Bumpy Johnson wasn't reacting. He wasn't collapsing. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't being restrained, he was smiling, not wide, not wild, amused. Then he laughed, quiet at first, controlled, the kind of laughter that doesn't ask permission. The sound cut through the chaos like a blade. Thorne froze. This wasn't part of the design. Men who receive death sentences do not laugh. "What is amusing, Mr. Johnson?" the judge barked. "Perhaps you didn't hear me." Bumpy wiped his eye with a handkerchief, like a man enjoying a good story. "I heard you," he said. Then he did the unforgivable. He called the judge by his first name. Harrison. The courtroom inhaled. Hierarchy collapsed in that single syllable. That was the moment, though no one fully understood it yet, when the trial ended for real. Because the man who was supposed to be broken had just informed the judge that this story was no longer his to tell. And in the next moments, the room would learn who had actually been on trial all along. At first, Judge Thorne responded the only way he knew how, with authority. He threatened contempt. He raised his voice. He reached for procedure like a weapon, believing volume could restore order the way it always had. But something fundamental had shifted, because power, once questioned, does not respond well to being laughed at. "What you find funny," Thorne snapped, "is that you are finished. 40 years. You will die behind bars." That was supposed to end it. Bumpy. Johnson looked at him, not with anger, not with defiance, but with pity. That look disturbed Thorne more than the laughter. "You can give me 100 years, Bumpy said calmly. "It won't matter." Thorne leaned forward, furious now. "Are you threatening this court?" "No," Bumpy replied. "I'm correcting it." Correction. That word landed wrong. Thorne was a man who issued corrections, not received them. "You see," Bumpy continued, his voice steady enough to quiet the room, "you thought you were dealing with a criminal who reacts after the fact, someone who waits for the verdict and then scrambles." He paused. "That's not how I live." For the first time, a sliver of uncertainty crept into the judge's face, because certainty depends on assumption, and Thorne's assumptions were beginning to rot. Bumpy turned slightly toward his attorney. The lawyer's name barely mattered. Men like him existed to push paper and pray. His hands were shaking before Bumpy even spoke. "Give it to him." The attorney hesitated. That hesitation was the sound of a man realizing he had been standing next to a controlled explosion this entire time. From the briefcase came a thick manila envelope, sealed, heavy, deliberate. Thorne scoffed. "The evidentiary phase is over. This court will not—" "It's not evidence," Bumpy said. "It's history." Bumpy took the envelope himself. He didn't rush. He didn't posture. He walked toward the bench with the confidence of someone who knows exactly how close he's allowed to get. The bailiffs moved instinctively, hands brushing leather, waiting for instruction. Thorne hesitated. That hesitation mattered. Bumpy stopped at the rail and tossed the envelope onto the desk. It landed with a sound that carried farther than the gavel ever had. "Open it," Thorne laughed, thin and nervous. "I will not participate in theatrics." "If you don't," Bumpy said, "the man in the back row, wearing gray, will leave this courtroom and distribute copies of what's inside to the New York Times and the FBI." Thorne's eyes flicked involuntarily. There was a man in gray, standing still, holding another envelope. This was not improvisation. This was choreography. For the first time that day, Judge Harrison Thorne felt something unfamiliar. Exposure. Slowly, carefully, he broke the seal. The first document was a photograph, black and white, grainy, indisputable. It showed Thorne sitting in a dim restaurant across from a man he had publicly sworn to destroy, a senior figure from the Italian syndicate. Between them sat an open briefcase, cash stacked like bricks. The color drained from Thorne's face so fast it looked unnatural, as if blood itself had been called away. He flipped the page. A bank ledger. Swiss. Numbers precise enough to be cruel. Dates matched, amounts undeniable. The room didn't need explanation. Corruption has a language everyone understands. Thorne's hands began to shake. This was the moment the myth of his invincibility collapsed, not with a scream, but with paperwork. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You called me an animal," he said, "but the man in that photograph floods Harlem with poison every week, and you took his money." The prosecutor stood on instinct. "Objection!" Thorne didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth opened, then closed. The authority that had filled that room for decades leaked out through silence. "You sold the law," Bumpy continued. "You wore robes and preached order while taking blood money under the table." No one moved. No one breathed. The courtroom had become a vacuum. And then the doors opened. 4 men entered, dark suits, fedoras, trench coats despite the heat. One badge caught the light. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words didn't echo. They didn't have to. The agent walked straight past Bumpy, straight to the bench. "Judge Harrison Thorne," he said, "you are under arrest." In that moment, the hierarchy inverted. The highest authority in the room was now the smallest man in it. Steel cuffs closed around wrists that had once commanded silence. Click, click. That sound, clean, final, did what the verdict never could. It told the truth. Thorne was led down from the bench, step by step, until he stood on the same floor as the man he had tried to erase. Bumpy leaned in, not to gloat, to instruct. 40 years is a long time," he whispered. "Choose your friends carefully." As Thorne was dragged away, the courtroom didn't celebrate. It recalibrated. Because everyone present understood something had been revealed that could not be unseen. The law had not been challenged. It had been audited, and it had failed. The courtroom didn't explode into cheers. That's important. People expect justice to sound loud when it arrives, but real justice doesn't announce itself. It leaves behind silence, confusion, and a sudden rearranging of fear. As Judge Harrison Thorne was led away in handcuffs, the room didn't know how to behave. The script everyone had memorized no longer applied. The prosecutors gathered their papers too quickly. The reporters didn't know which headline to write first. The jury stared straight ahead, understanding, too late, that they had been props. And Harlem watched, not with triumph, with recognition. Because Harlem understood something the city's elite never did. When a man like Thorne falls, he doesn't fall alone, and he doesn't fall quietly. Power never does. Outside the courthouse, flashbulbs detonated. Cameras chased the image of a judge in cuffs like predators. The same men who had defended him in private now avoided his name in public. By nightfall, the story would be framed as a scandal, a bad apple, an exception, a shock. That framing was deliberate. Systems survive by pretending corruption is accidental. But inside the city's underground, inside the rooms without windows, no one was fooled. Because the envelope Bumpy Johnson had revealed didn't just expose a judge, it exposed a pipeline. Money didn't flow upward by accident, it flowed because people allowed it to. And now, everyone who had ever used Judge Thorne as a shield felt the cold air hit their backs. Police captains canceled meetings, fixers burned notes, middlemen stopped answering phones, not because they feared the law, because they feared Bumpy Johnson. He had done something far more dangerous than violence. He had demonstrated leverage. And leverage, once revealed, spreads panic faster than bloodshed ever could. In Harlem, the news moved differently. It traveled through barbershops, stoops, churches, and numbers houses. It wasn't shouted. It was shared quietly, with disbelief at first, and then pride. The king hadn't just survived the system, he had been it until it exposed itself. That mattered. Because Harlem had watched. Too many men be dragged away while the men in suits walked free. This time, the man in the suit was the one crying. But celebration didn't last. Bumpy Johnson understood something most of his supporters did not. Humiliation creates enemies faster than violence ever could, and Judge Thorne was only one node in a much larger network. The Italians noticed immediately. The photograph Bumpy had used wasn't just incriminating, it was radioactive. It connected the judiciary to organized crime in a way that couldn't be denied, even if it was officially buried later. One family in particular felt exposed: the Genovese. For years they had operated on a simple assumption: judges were safer than soldiers. Judges wore robes. Judges were insulated. Judges didn't get arrested in open court. That assumption was now dead. And dead assumptions make dangerous men nervous. When Bumpy walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, the air felt different. Not cleaner, sharper. Waiting near the aisle steps was a black sedan, not police, not federal, Italian. Leaning against it was Chin Gigante. He didn't smile. Men like Chin didn't do public emotion. His expression was flat, but his eyes were alert, the eyes of someone recalculating risk in real time. "You made noise today," Chin said. "I had to," Bumpy replied. "Quiet gets ignored." Chin didn't argue. He didn't threaten either. That was telling. Instead, he said what mattered. "That judge was useful," Bumpy nodded. "He was sloppy." That was the truth both men shared. Corruption isn't condemned in their world. It's managed, and Thorne had failed at management. "You cost me an asset," Chin said. "You lost a liability," Bumpy corrected. "And you didn't lose Harlem." Silence stretched between them. Both men understood what was being negotiated without numbers ever being spoken. Finally, Chin exhaled. "Watch your back." Bumpy didn't flinch. "I always do." The sedan drove off. No shots, no shouting, just acknowledgement. That was peace, for now. But while the underworld recalibrated, the police were spiraling. Vice squads were furious. Narcotics units were paranoid. Internal Affairs suddenly had files open they didn't remember requesting. Because Bumpy Johnson hadn't just exposed a judge, he had implied there was more. And implication is poison. One detective in particular took it personally, Lieutenant O'Malley. For years, O'Malley had functioned as Thorne's shadow, collecting, delivering, smoothing problems away. Without the judge, O'Malley wasn't powerful. He was vulnerable. So he went looking for Bumpy. He found him that evening in a place no one expected. An Irish club. Territory that wasn't supposed to welcome men like him. When O'Malley burst through the door, gun half raised, rage doing the thinking for him, he believed intimidation would still work. He believed the badge still mattered. He was wrong. Bumpy didn't turn around. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for a glass. And when O'Malley threatened Harlem, threatened raids, violence, retaliation, Bumpy responded with the only language that matters to men who abuse authority. Insurance. Another envelope. Another ledger. Another reminder that corruption creates hostages. O'Malley understood instantly. He wasn't dealing with a gangster. He was dealing with an archivist. And archivists are dangerous because they remember everything. The threat dissolved. The badge meant nothing. That night, police cars stayed north of 110th Street. Harlem celebrated, quietly, not with fireworks, but with relief. Because for once, the system had blinked first. And while the city tried to spin the story into something digestible, one truth had already set in across New York. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had not beaten the law. He had shown everyone where it broke. The city moved on faster than Bumpy expected. That was the first warning. New scandals replaced old ones. New judges filled empty seats. The newspapers buried the Thorne story under layers of commentary, distance, and selective memory. Public outrage has a short half-life, but consequences don't. Because when you expose a system, you don't destroy it, you offend it, and systems don't forgive, they adapt. For Bumpy Johnson, the change came quietly at first. The phones rang less, the meetings grew shorter. Men who used to speak freely now measured every word, not because they doubted him, but because they feared proximity. Power attracts allies. Exposure attracts distance. Harlem still respected him, but respect is not protection, it's admiration from afar. And Bumpy had learned long ago that isolation is more dangerous than enemies. He felt it in the streets. Corners that once stayed calm now buzzed with unfamiliar faces. Small crews tested boundaries that had held firm for years. Messages arrived late, or not at all. This wasn't rebellion. It was recalibration. The underworld was asking itself a quiet question. If Bumpy Johnson could bring down a judge, what might he do to us? Trust, once cracked, never returns whole. Even Chin Gigante grew distant. Their arrangement remained intact on paper, but the tone had changed. Where there was once mutual respect, there was now caution. And caution, in men like Chin, is a prelude to contingency planning. Bumpy noticed the change immediately. He always did. One evening, he sat alone in his apartment, lights low, records playing softly. Classical. He preferred it that way, music without words, because words could lie. He stared at the wall, not thinking about enemies, thinking about time, because exposure doesn't shorten a man's life instantly. It stretches it thin. Every day becomes heavier. Every decision carries echoes. Every silence feels deliberate. That was the real price of the courtroom victory. Not fear, awareness. He had crossed an invisible line. Violence had rules. Money had rules. Even corruption had rules. But humiliation? Humiliation rewrites the game. The men who had lost face because of Judge Thorne didn't want Bumpy dead. They wanted him diminished. They wanted him nervous, distracted, questioning his own shadow. And that's exactly what they engineered. Police pressure increased, not overtly, not loudly, but constantly. Random stops, surprise inspections, friendly warnings delivered with unfriendly smiles, nothing illegal, everything exhausting. Bumpy understood the message. You may have won once, you will pay every day after. Even Harlem changed. People still nodded, still smiled, still spoke his name with reverence. But reverence carries expectation, and expectation is a kind of burden. They believed that he was untouchable now. Bumpy knew better. Untouchable men don't die of heart attacks. They don't collapse alone in diners. They don't get buried while the city keeps moving. Power doesn't make you immortal. It just changes how you're hunted. Late one night, Bumpy met with a young runner who'd grown nervous, too nervous. His hands shook when he talked. His eyes darted when they shouldn't have. "Who's asking questions?" Bumpy asked. The kid hesitated. That hesitation answered everything. "There's talk," the runner said. "That maybe you went too far." Bumpy didn't react. He took a sip of coffee. Let the words settle. "Far from what?" he asked calmly. The runner couldn't answer, because that was the problem. No one knew where the line was anymore. And when lines disappear, paranoia fills the space. Bumpy dismissed him gently. No threats, no warnings. After the door closed, he sat alone again. He thought about the judge. Harrison Thorne was sitting in a cell now, stripped of title, stripped of certainty, stripped of the illusion that the system protected its own forever. But Thorne still had something Bumpy didn't: an ending. Prison is terrible, but it is finite. It has walls. It has routine. It has a shape. Power has none. Bumpy's punishment wasn't confinement. It was continuation, the constant calculation, the endless awareness. The knowledge that the move he made to protect Harlem had also guaranteed that Harlem would never be safe in the same way again. Because once people see the machinery behind authority, they don't unsee it. And men who reveal machinery become symbols. Symbols get targeted, not by rage, but by patience. Bumpy understood now why older kings stepped aside quietly. Not because they were weak, because they were tired. He had won a battle the city would never fully acknowledge, and in doing so, he had placed himself permanently in the crosshairs of history. That night, he turned off the music. The room fell silent. And in that silence, one truth became unavoidable. The courtroom victory didn't free him. It finalized him. History didn't know what to do with Bumpy Johnson after that. It never does with men who don't fit clean. Endings. He didn't fall in a hail of bullets. He didn't disappear into exile. He didn't get crowned or crucified in a single moment. He simply remained. And that confused people, because the story they wanted required symmetry: rise, reign, downfall. Something clean enough to summarize in a paragraph, dramatic enough to justify forgetting the details. But Bumpy Johnson became inconvenient. He lived long enough to be misremembered. The city softened him in hindsight. Newspapers started calling him a Harlem character. Documentaries labeled him a complex figure. Academics debated whether he was a criminal or a community leader, as if those were mutually exclusive categories. That debate was the lie. Because men like Bumpy don't live in categories. They live in contradictions. The courtroom moment, the day a judge fell, became a footnote, too uncomfortable, too revealing. It didn't fit the moral arc the city preferred. So it was reframed. Over time it became, "I'm at easier," but alleged. Then disputed. Then barely mentioned at all. Power doesn't erase the past. It edits it. And edits are always quieter than censorship. But in Harlem, memory worked differently. The older men remembered the silence after the verdict, the way police cars slowed, the way raids stopped feeling inevitable. They remembered that for a brief window, the city blinked. That mattered more than headlines. Bumpy himself never spoke about the judge again, not out of fear, out of understanding. Victories don't age well. They grow brittle. The more you touch them, the more they crack. So he moved forward, older now, heavier in ways no scale could measure. He spent more time alone, more time thinking, less time performing power, and more time managing its decay. The streets changed. Heroin replaced numbers. Younger men replaced codes with impulsiveness. Violence became louder, dumber, and harder to control. Bumpy saw it coming. He warned people. They didn't listen. Because profits are only appreciated after they're gone, and even then, selectively. The Italians held their line. The police kept their pressure. The city kept pretending equilibrium had been restored. But something had shifted permanently. Everyone knew the system could bleed. They just pretended they hadn't seen it. In 1968, when Bumpy Johnson died quietly, slumped over a plate of food in a restaurant, the city barely paused. No sirens, no lockdowns, no acknowledgments. A man who once held judges hostage with truth left the world without drama. That irony would have amused him. At his funeral, the crowd was large but subdued, respectful, not reverent, as if people weren't sure which version of him they were allowed to mourn. Gangster, protector, strategist, threat, all true, all incomplete. What the city never admitted, what history still avoids, is that Bumpy Johnson didn't just navigate corruption. He mapped it. He showed that justice wasn't broken by accident. It was designed with exits for certain people and traps for others. And for one moment, just one, he forced it to show its seams. That moment cost him comfort, peace, and eventually relevance. But it bought Harlem time to breathe, time to regroup, time to remember that authority is not the same as legitimacy. That's the part they don't teach. Because if people understood that lesson fully, they'd start asking dangerous questions. Not about men like Bumpy Johnson, but about the system that required men like him to exist in the first place. And that question has no clean answer, only echoes.